Good evening and welcome to the School of Social Sciences and Institution of Eminence Golden Jubilee Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm very happy to invite Urvashi Butalia to deliver her talk on the researcher and the researched, the challenges of feminist knowledge production. Here is a humble introduction to a stalwart in feminist studies, in women's histories. Urvashi Butalia is a writer, researcher, publisher, historian, and a teacher. She co-founded Kali for Women, India's first feminist publishing house, along with Ritu Menon in 1984. In 2003, she founded Zubaan Books, an imprint of Kali for Women, while Ritu Menon established Women Unlimited. Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon were jointly awarded Padma Shri in 2011 for their work in literature and education. Urvashi Butalia has many other awards and honors to her credit. She worked with Oxford University Press, New Delhi, initially, then Z Books, London, before establishing Zubaan Books. Zubaan is a leading independent publishing house, as many of you are aware of, which is based in New Delhi with a strong feminist spirit in publishing and has published authors such as Nivedita Menon, Manjula Padmanabhan, and Suneetha Namjoshi, and many others. To cite a few works of Butalia out of many works that she has published, one is Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon, in other words, published in 1992. Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon, Making a Difference, Feminist Publishing in the South, published in 1995. Tanika Sarkar and Urvashi Butalia, Women and the Hindu Right, a collection of essays, published in 1995. Tanika Sarkar and Urvashi Butalia, Women in Right-Wing Movements, Indian Experiences, published in 1995. And the books that influenced and inspired many researchers like us, one of them being The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India, published in 1998. Then Speaking Peace, Women's Voices from Kashmir, published in 2002. A multilingual scholar, Urvashi Butalia has published articles in several newspapers apart from publishing the books. Currently, she is a visiting faculty, Young India Fellowship, Ashoka University. And she is currently working on the life of a Hijra friend of hers, Mona Ahmed. Urvashi, we consider it a privilege to be able to listen to you here in your presence. Welcome once again, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And I must here extend our thanks to the Dean of School of Social Sciences and Institution of Eminence for facilitating this talk as part of the series of distinguished lectures. Urvashi, please.
Yeah, can you hear me? Is this at the right level? Yeah. Should we move this a bit this way so that you're comfortable, or are you okay? You're all right? Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Suneetha. Thank you, everybody. I am delighted to be here and a little bit nervous because there are so many of you in the room. And I'm going to be speaking almost for an hour, and I hope you don't die of boredom. If you do, just leave quietly. Yeah, okay. So thank you. Formally, I'm honored to be among the speakers for your Golden Jubilee series. You know, in this day and age, for a university to inaugurate a significant anniversary by inviting a diverse, inclusive lineup of speakers whose work spans the arts, sciences, history, technology, education, caste, feminism, and so much more, I think this is an act of faith and an act of courage, as the Dean pointed out in one of his introductions, and an act of truth-seeking. And I am so grateful to you for making me part of this journey. Of course, it's not surprising that this act of faith should be taking place at Hyderabad University, where so much thinking, protest, and tragedy have unfolded. But specifically, my thanks to the Dean, Professor Jyotirmay Sharma, the School of Social Sciences Institution of Eminence, and Suneetha and the Center of Women's Studies, and all of you for being here. I'm also particularly pleased to be here because this region has a long and rich history of women's activism, whether it is in the Telangana People's Movement of the 40s or in the work of later feminists in the field of politics, literature, academia, and so much more. And several of our authors at Zubaan come from here, and I want to take this opportunity to say both how privileged and how proud we are to have published literature and writing from here and by women from here, but not enough of it. And I do want to rectify that and try to see we can do more. It's customary to begin a talk with some disclaimers. This helps those listening to the talk to get an idea of what to expect and what not to expect. So here are my disclaimers. All of you are academics, historians, sociologists, ethnographers, literature people, and me, I'm a publisher and an occasional writer, kind of failed writer. Suneetha listed many of my books, but I'm actually a one-book wonder. I've only ever written that one book in my life, The Other Side of Silence. And it's really difficult to write full-length books when you're a publisher because you're always thinking of publishing other people's books. So in many ways, I stand outside all of these disciplines and indeed outside of academia, and this is by choice. So I am a bit of an interloper here, which is why I'm doubly grateful for having been invited. I have to say that being an interloper is nothing new for me. As women, we get used to this every time we walk into an all-male gathering, and most gatherings are still largely male. You are reminded of your status as an interloper. But I'm not claiming the interloper status just to be cute, but really to alert you to the standpoint from where I'll be speaking, which is somewhere between the space that lies between academia and activism, and in particular feminist activism, and from a space that is free of disciplinary boundaries and which therefore takes in a little bit of everything, rather like a khichdi. What I want to talk about today is a set of concerns and questions that I've been grappling with as a researcher and writer and someone who's in the business of feminist knowledge production. My presentation will be fully anecdotal. I make no apologies for that. Stories are what animate my work. They are my inspiration, and it is stories that I will tell here today. The stories come from my experience as a writer and a publisher and raise issues of the kind of dilemmas that we as writers, both academic and otherwise, are confronted with today, which to my mind make our work more daunting and more exciting. What the stories also do in many ways is to alert us as writers and researchers to what lies at the other end of the spectrum, which is inhabited by, within quotes, the subjects of our research. These spaces, that is the space of the researcher and the researched, have for the longest time been assumed to be quite separate. But over the years, this has been changing, and I'd like to explore here both how they're changing and what that change means for us. Before I do that, let me try to explain what I mean by the separateness of these spaces. In somewhat simplistic terms, those who identify themselves as researchers are seen to occupy some kind of lofty space where knowledge is generated and where theory is expounded. This is echoing. Is it just me or is it actually happening? Are you all feeling it? Yeah, that may be better. Thank you so much. That's right. So researchers are seen as occupying some kind of lofty space where knowledge is generated and where theory is expounded. I think I'll just turn it away from me. This space, can you still hear me at the back? Here? Okay. This space carries with it an assumption of neutrality and objectivity. See, what a simple solution to technology. I just turned it away and it worked better. Is that okay? Okay, so this space carries with it an assumption of neutrality and objectivity. By contrast, the subjects of their research are generally seen as those inhabiting the realm of experience, I use it within quotes, which qualifies them as the field on which theory is based. Then somewhere these two areas get associated with power. One is the realm of the powerful, the other the realm of the powerless. As always, when we are speaking of power, money makes its presence felt. So those with power have access to it, and importantly, are assumed to have a kind of natural knowledge how to deal with money fairly and with responsibility. And those without are generally poor and therefore are somehow vulnerable to being corrupted by money. And this leads to the assumption that researchers must never pay their subjects. Because of the way power plays out in the world, and more specifically in the world of knowledge creation, these differences also fit into the assumption that the knowledge proved in the West, or in the North, whatever you call it, comes to acquire more value and is seen as universal, while we here provide the specifics and the theory and practice separation therefore gets played out all over again. Further categorizations follow here. Because most academic fields were and continue to be dominated by men, knowledge produced by them is somehow superior, seen as more neutral, and therefore universal, even though it may be only about them. And that produced by women is somehow seen as lacking because it is subjective, it is specific, it is small. It follows then that because academic fields are dominated by upper castes, knowledge produced by them is also superior, and that created by those on the ground, not so. I will not expound any further on this. You know what I'm talking about, so I don't need to go into that. This rather simple picture that I've drawn, and of course nothing is ever that simple, has, as I've mentioned, begun to change, and the impetus of change comes from the ground up. I want particularly here to address the kind of change that has been brought about by feminist research and the tools and methodologies it brings to the equation. What do I mean by feminist research? That will, I hope, emerge in the course of my presentation, but briefly, I mean this. Feminist research is that which comes out of feminist and women's movements. It is research that makes no pretense at neutrality. It is research that is not an end in itself, but rather an intervention towards change and transformation. It is research whose methods are unorthodox, whose tools are different from the standard, research that does not take data as sacrosanct and brings in stories and lives, research that is collaborative and participatory. It is research whose methodologies and tools are evolving and adapting. And it is research that asks the difficult question, many difficult questions, both of existing forms of research and of itself. This kind of research writing, knowledge creation, especially where women are concerned, is relatively recent on our horizon. In academic terms, for example, it wasn't until women's studies made its appearance on the academic horizon in the mid-70s in India that we were even able to, within quotes, study women as such. The arrival of women's studies brought about a major change that has thus far, I think, remained largely unnoticed. It established that the public sphere, the world of men, was not the only legitimate area for research, but that the private, that which lay within the four walls of the home, was equally deserving of being studied. It also cautioned that the moment you cross that threshold into the private space, the realities changed. For here you met something very different from what you saw in the outside world. Here you met emotions, you met feelings, you met stories, you met connections. You didn't meet dry, arid data. But the change that women's studies brought about was slow to sink in. For women's studies itself was fighting a battle merely to exist, and that still goes on today. So it is not surprising, for example, that it wasn't until the 1990s, specifically the year 1991, that the biggest data gathering exercise that takes place in India decadally, and which hasn't taken place for some time now, as we know, the census of India, actually started to ask questions about work that included women. Previous to this, the question was only ever put to men, and it went something like this. Census enumerator asks the man, "What work do you do?" Man answers, "I'm a farmer or a factory worker or XYZ. Enumerator asks the next question also to the man, "What does your wife do?" Answer, "Nothing." That's how it went till 1991. So these are some of the assumptions I want to explore in my talk. I want to do this by telling you 3 stories of 3 different feminist research writing projects and looking at the questions they raise. The stories are a bit disparate. You may wonder what they have to do with each other, but there are connections and resonances, and I'll try to tease them out towards the end. Let me begin then with the story I know best, which is my own. This story has to do with the subject of writing lives. A little over 30 years ago, I met while researching a book I was writing on partition. That's what The Other Side of Silence became. A hijra called Mona Ahmed, who lived in a graveyard in the heart of Delhi. The bare bones of Mona's story are as follows. She was born a boy, or rather, she was male assigned at birth. But from a young age, she believed quite strongly that she had been born in the wrong body. And when she was 18, she decided to take the first step to transition to the identity that she knew with a deep conviction was hers, even if her body told her otherwise. Mona thought, what is the body after all? Just an outwardly shell, which can be subjected to the surgeon's scalpel and altered. In her mind, she had always known she was a woman. She had herself castrated and joined the hijras, who formed their own close communities and lived by singing and dancing or offering blessings in return for money. At my first meeting with her, Mona was preoccupied with many things, but generously she made time to talk to me about partition and provided me with some amazing stories about the transgender experience of partition. In the normal course of things, the researcher-researched encounter would have ended there, but it did not. Instead, it got a bit turned on its head. A few days after we met, Mona called me up. She surprised me by asking if I would be interested in writing a book about her. I found the invitation both exciting and daunting, and also quite honestly a bit surprising. I say surprising because when we as researchers approach human subjects for our research, it's not usually they who tell us what to do, but we who go with our expectations and assume that they will somehow fit themselves to those. No matter how hard we tell ourselves otherwise, somewhere inside us, we carry the assumption that the people we are talking to are our, within quotes, informants, and that they will, without questioning us, accept the legitimacy of our mission and respond to our needs. That they will have needs, wants, desires of their own is something we don't often consider. So when Mona turned to me and said, "I've heard you're a writer, would you like to write my life?" Part of my surprise came because somewhere inside me, I too had carried that assumption. And her taking of the initiative took a bit of the power of decision-making away from me. So I think at the heart of my discomfort was that, which I only managed to identify years later when I was being honest with myself. By the time I met Mona, I was at the tail end of my research on partition and had begun to reflect on the mass of material I had gathered and was trying to make some sense of it. That research, conducted over a decade, led me to speak often at great length to people, especially women, and over time, many of them became friends, the more so as the communication, initially one way, became more like a conversation and the stories began to be shared. At the time, I was also deeply involved in feminist activism, and my years of involvement in the women's movement had taught me a lesson I've carried with me all my life, the importance of listening. Indeed, one of the most rewarding experiences of being involved in the women's movement in India was of the listening groups we formed where women sat and shared their stories. I mention this also because the entanglement of the personal in your research lies at the very heart of feminist research. Just as an aside, I was in one such group last week where 15 women came together to reconstruct a moment in the history of the struggle against sexual violence in India. This was the moment of the making of the Vishaka petition. And as we sat together and remembered, there was the chaos and the mixing of time that happens when people remember collectively, but there was also pain, there was laughter, there was joy, anger, and so much more. It was in such discussions long ago that I began to realize that what seemed like everyday anecdotes of discrimination, violence, oppression, heartbreak were actually stories filled with wisdom and knowledge and with what we today call experience. It was also that experience that convinced me as a researcher of the value of something researchers have traditionally dismissed as if it is an inferior form of knowledge, the personal story or the anecdote. I'll come back to this point a little bit later. That experience taught me the importance of listening to those whose voices are traditionally silenced or not heard, and of learning to listen differently. That is, listening not only to what the women said, but also to their silences, to what lay beneath the words and remained unsaid, what was sometimes unspeakable, listening to the body language, the hesitations, and it was that experience that opened up for me what was to become a major preoccupation later in life, the question of language, experience, and vocabulary. If the experience itself is unspeakable, where will you find the words to describe it? Caste violence, for example, is so widespread and so naturalized that we hardly speak about it. But were we to do so, where would we find the words to describe something so horrific, so brutal? What I also learned in those interviews was that once you began to talk as women, it became very difficult to maintain the distance that traditional wisdom tells us has to be there between the researcher and the researched. The women became my friends, our interviews became conversations, and any pretense of neutrality went out of the door. And there was another thing. At the time I was doing that work, I believed, like many researchers do, that while the interview may be an act of power, there is something about it that must somehow remain pure. That relationship cannot be sullied by, say, mundane things like money, as that would corrupt the interaction. While much has changed in this research in the last few years, and many of the old assumptions have been questioned, this one has retained a remarkable resilience. And I want to ask you to park this thought. I'm going to come back to it a bit later. When we began work together, Mona's and my interactions were much more intense than the ones I have spoken about previously in women's groups, because they were one-on-one. Mona and I were just two individuals, not a group or a collective, and our conversation spread over more than a decade. The decision to write a book, as I've said, was not mine but hers. She wanted the book and she thought I could do it, but I wasn't an unwilling partner. And because of this, it somehow felt, perhaps wrongly, that the hierarchy of the writer and the subject had been subverted. But along the way, other things happened that complicated this relationship. So over the years, as we got to know each other better, the two of us, our equation as two individuals changed. As two individuals engaged in the task of writing, one the writer, the other the subject, changed and transformed into a friendship, collapsing the distance that sometimes defines the writer-subject relationship. Instead of researcher and research, we became just two women talking together. The recording device and the notebook were abandoned. With that, our discussions became much deeper, but my dilemmas grew. Like all friends who cast themselves in the role of listeners, as I did, I found myself fascinated and absorbed, but sometimes also disbelieving or skeptical of the things she said, and I wondered how I could write these into my narrative. Generally, in life writing or in ethnographic research, those of us who step in as researchers carry the expectation that the subjects of our research will be the tellers of single stories, and that the narratives we will receive will somehow cohere so that we may be able to read a pattern into them. Complexity and contradiction pose particular problems, although they are so enriching. And also, as does the researcher's search for often just a single truth. I mentioned that I was often disbelieving of the things Mona said. I suspected, in fact, I knew, that she was trying to shape my narrative the way she wanted it, a story in which she was the victim. How was I to deal with this? My rational self told me a writer's skepticism towards her subject was permissible, part of the writer's freedom of thought, speech, expression. My emotional self felt otherwise. I wanted to do right by Mona. I knew she was looking for empathy, for understanding, perhaps also for a kind of justice. So in the end, what or whose would be the truth of my story? Mona was immediately able to sense my doubt and skepticism, and she started to challenge me about it. She said, why is it so difficult to understand that a human being can be made up of multiple truths, multiple and contradictory desires? These contestations made my task more difficult, but also in some ways more interesting, as did the growing distance between how she saw her life as the subject of her book and how I perceived and received and then represented what she told me about herself. I think all of us will be familiar with this dilemma. When the researcher sets up an interaction with their subject, there is also a certain kind of expectation that accompanies that interaction. All too often, the expectation we carry in our heads is that which we want and expect. We don't often think of what the subject will or may want. Another question that troubled me when I was working with Mona was this. Effectively, I was writing a life. I was very clear from the start, as was Mona, that the work she wanted me to undertake was her individual story, not a collective story about the Hijra community. But what were the resources I could draw on to write this life? Was such a life even, within quotes, worthy of being written about? You know, so much life writing is about great lives. When you start to write a life, or more correctly, when you start to write a marginal life, rather than, say, a mainstream life, the materials you can draw on to build the picture you're seeking are often scattered, ephemeral, thin on the ground. There are no papers housed in an archive or meticulously catalogued at home. No library sources or newspaper clippings, no letters carefully saved. Most times there isn't even a vast circle of knowledgeable friends and acquaintances whose memories and stories that you can draw on. All you have is the person themselves, and if you're lucky, their memories, perhaps objects, clothes, things they may have retained that can offer some clues. But when your subject has wiped out, or more correctly thrown away, as Mona periodically did, all material traces of their past life, there is even less to draw on. Mona hated her past life. So she kept diaries which she would periodically burn and throw away. It is here that the conversation, the interview, the sense of the person that you imbibe from a certain proximity, these become your often somewhat problematic sources. Problematic because as sources go, life writing relies upon certain given ingredients that provide in different proportions the whole that makes up a life. The descriptions of moments, places, people help us to build a sort of linear trajectory, and we believe as we read that we are getting to know the person, to understand them, perhaps even to empathize with them. In Mona's case, the ingredients themselves were elusive. The moment you thought you had grasped something, she would turn it on its head and change the narrative. As a writer, then, I was faced with another dilemma: how to deal with the truth-telling required of writing a life when the archive itself was shifting, unpredictable, and elusive. In the truth-seeking that life writing inevitably involves, or is supposed to be premised on, whose truth should the writer privilege? That was a question that was left with me. And another complicating factor was that Mona was much written about. She was so unique, very much herself, and every foreign journalist who came to write the Hijra story in India, and that time, believe me, there were many foreign journalists, and there was only one Hijra story. That was Mona's story, because trans issues had not become articulated in the way that they are today. So every foreign journalist would go to see Mona to write her story. Many people had written about her, including Debomita Singh, the photographer, who did a wonderful book of photographs and another book. So what more was there to say about her? And that was another question I was trying to deal with, that is there a point in research when the subject that you're researching is done and dusted and no more can be said about them, or no more knowledge can be sought about them? A last question about Mona that haunted me and continues to do so is this. Mona was, as I've said, a hijra, born in the male body. She knew that she wanted to be a woman. She faced violence, censure, abuse for behaving like a woman. Finally, she left home and joined the hijras, but here too she wasn't happy. She wanted to be accepted for who she was in what she called mainstream normal society. She did not want to be placed in a silo to the side. Finally, in an attempt to match her body to what her mind already knew, Mona underwent a sort of sex change surgery. I say sort of because SRS was not common or legal at that time. As I began to write the book, I asked myself again and again, identity was at the heart of Mona's life and dilemmas. She was a hijra, trans woman. Should it not then logically follow that someone from within her community should have been writing about her and not, as I would be known today, a cis-het woman? I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this question. It comes back to haunt writers all the time. Can only like write about like? I have no answer to this, and it still lives inside my mind. But whenever I'm arguing this with myself, I counter it with another question that I have, which is that I knew Mona closely for over 2 decades. And during that time, we met every week on Sundays for 1 hour or 3, and we talked. Did I, as her friend and perhaps as one of the people she was most intimate with, but who did not belong to her community, not have the legitimate right to write about her? Can friendship, even a kind of intimacy, trump the legitimacy of identity? So that's a question that I am leaving with you. For me, this question becomes even more important because in my professional life, as you know, I am a publisher. And a publisher whose mandate is to foreground the voices of women, Dalit, Bahujan, queer, trans, and other persons from marginalized communities. This means seeking knowledge created by people who belong to these identities and not about them by those who occupy positions of privilege and power. For example, by and large, we will not publish men writing about women, and are equally hesitant to publish Western women writing about South Asian women. But here I was in my own research using the opposite argument, and I have no way of knowing how to deal with this or to justify it. Let me now turn to my next story that picks up some of the points I've mentioned here, in particular the last one. Before I do, I want to come back to a point I made earlier. It's one that as researchers, we often shy away from, and I've talked about this. Simply put, it's this. We've long carried an assumption that if we pay the subjects of our research, the relationship somehow becomes impure. I'm not entirely sure where this comes from, but while I was working with Mona, there were so many occasions on which I was invited to speak about her, and every single one of them was paid. And I could not escape the question, is it right for me to be paid and for her not? What is it about my location that establishes that I will not be corrupted by that money? And what is it about her location that presumes that she will? Does purity work only in one direction? Why do we as researchers shy away from this question? Our time is paid, our travel is paid, our writings benefit us, whether in academic terms or otherwise, but we do not want to pay the subjects we work with. I'll leave this question with you, and I will turn to my second story. This story has to do with a book on queerness in India, published some years ago. The author is a well-known Indian academic based in South Africa. She has strong links with India. For this book, she met with queer groups in India and spent time with them. In one particular group, she spent time in their offices, accessed their archive, interviewed members of their cohort, all with their permission. When the book came out, however, this particular group, the group is called Sappho for Equality, they are based in Kolkata, was unhappy, and they wrote an open letter to the author, which was shared on a feminist network in India. The letter, while appreciating the author's work generally, raised some ethical and methodological questions about her research for this book, in particular about the author's interaction with this group. They pointed to a lack of what they called proper trust building. They pointed to irregular communication. They pointed to what they called an extractive attitude to seeking information and erratic, brief, and formal interactions with members of the group. They asked, and I quote them here, "What does the above involvement show in terms of feminist ethnographic research? From our understanding of feminist research, trust and continuous engagement are necessary for ethnographic work and during times and ways that suit both researchers and participants. It was only expected that we would be consulted and argued with at every step of the research process." End of quote. They listed several things that they felt were not respectful of their role. They said the research proposal had not been shared with them, nor were the transcripts of the interviews the researcher had done, and they felt that they had been reduced to data, and they pointed to the need for consent and trust building. The way the academic conducted her research, the group said, made them feel like they were case study subjects of the third world for the international academic. They asked, don't we have the space and capacity to think critically about our institutionalization and its complicated histories along with the researcher? Is the activist space only worthy of being used as experiential evidence of intellectualized arguments and hypotheses? They said they had also delved deep into their experiences and they were developing understandings of their experiences which were nuanced and layered. They were no longer willing to be mere case studies. They wanted to be consulted, they wanted to be heard, and they went on to make an important clarification, and I quote again. They say, our objection to the book does not stem from the belief that we are only comfortable doing research on ourselves. So this goes back to the point that I had raised earlier. But when academic and especially feminist academic research is trying to find newer methodologies and research areas where we do not study down, this kind of ethical violence stands out. At all times in their critique of the work, the group did not devalue the work of the writer. They spoke with respect about it, but they were very clear that their objections pertained to themselves, and they pointed to the ambivalences around these issues as subjects that needed open and thoughtful discussion. The questions I asked in my discussion on Mona are very present here, but in different ways. I was concerned whether without the standard tools of research, a stable archive, at least some solid material, my work would stand up to scrutiny. What sort of life writing can you build if the subject of your story is evasive and there are no reliable sources for you to draw on? And what legitimacy did I, as a cis woman, have to be writing the life of a trans woman? And finally, given that the subject of my research and I, as author, had not only become friends, but had different views on what the book should be, was I being dishonest, exploitative, extractive? The members of the queer group raised different but related questions. Were they not owed the respect of being seen as partners in research and not merely as the subjects of research? And that leads me to ask this question, which I have been grappling with, that should research be a partnership? Does the idea of research as a partnership provide us new ways of thinking about the process of knowledge creation? After all, the group said, we are thinking beings with agency and we deserve to be taken seriously. And does the writer not have an obligation to keep us in the loop at all times? They also felt they had been reduced to data, and that they felt insulted by. Until feminist research methodologies began to question existing methods of research and the tools they relied on, data were considered something sacrosanct, something that gave your research meaning and weight. And the human being that lay at the end of that data stream was reduced to a number or a nameless statistic or just an anecdote. This method of research has now been replaced with much more real, nuanced, and complex research that engages with the realities of human beings. And it would not be wrong to say that the major impetus for this change has come because of feminist interventions in research. One of the results of this is that the subjects of our research are no longer mute, voiceless beings. They're not willing to be subjected to extractive practices. They're not willing to be talked down to. Nearly half a century ago, when women's studies made its presence felt on the international scholarly horizon, there was a great deal of skepticism about it, such that its signal contribution to make the personal a legitimate area of research, and I've mentioned this before, to say that the public and the personal were deeply connected, to say that research could not stop at the threshold but had to enter the home, and that border crossing required different tools. This was not given the value it should have been given. Today, we know how much the entry of the personal has transformed our academic disciplines. But can researchers actually engage with their subjects? Is it even realistic to think of it? In this case, for example, the academic was placed at some considerable distance from the group and was bound by the rules of her university, particularly to do with confidentiality. In her response to the group's criticism, she pointed out that the rules of ethics of her university mandated that the transcripts of interviews could only be shared with the subjects of those interviews and not with the group in whose premises the interview had taken place and to whom these people belonged as members. But the subjects spoke Bengali, the transcripts were in English, so even if they had been shared with the subjects, what would have happened? So there isn't an answer to this question, but I'm leaving it with you while I take you now to my final story. And that is of a book co-authored by 9 women across 2 continents. This possibly offers us some way of addressing the questions that I have raised here. Originally in Hindi, the book appeared in English under the title Playing with Fire and came about, and we published it in Zubaan, that is why I'm so familiar with it, and came about through a collective process of sharing intimate personal stories within a supportive group, of giving voice with difficulty and hesitation to some of these for the first time. 9 women, 7 of them poor laboring women of different castes from Sitapur district in Uttar Pradesh, and 2 urban women, one an NGO worker and the other an academic from the US, came together to create this book. It was in collective discussions between the researcher and the researched that a method was identified which would keep the stories of the women in their own voices. The women met, told each other about their lives. They chose to read, write, share each other's stories in the form of diaries. The 2 academic writers, I put this word in quotes as they were not really both academic, then undertook to write the stories into a compiled and collective narrative, culling out those bits that related to the subject of particular chapters. By this I mean that while the narratives retain the individual voice, albeit in translation, they were separated out according to subject, childhood, marriage, children, and so on. They were then read back to the original speakers, and it was only when the group was happy with it as a group that the stories were finalized. And when the book was published, it was credited to all 9 women. The women described the process thus, and I quote them. They said, "When we were preparing ourselves to write this book, we felt a sense of adventure creeping into our bones. Would this world be able to see us, formerly uneducated women, as writers? Would it give us the same respect and wisdom that it accords to all its upper caste and elite scholars and thinkers? Would our readers be able to value the courage and trust with which we have pointed out our most cherished and intimate moments, our deepest sorrows and wounds of humiliations, and everything sweet and bitter that we have encountered in our lives? That's the end of the quote. Every time I read this quote in this book or I read it out, I get gooseflesh because I find it really moving how they articulated this. In the book, the village women asked certain key questions which resonate strongly with the questions raised by the group I've spoken of above. They asked, what is the difference between social empowerment and intellectual empowerment? Are they not two sides of the same coin? Their work was grassroots organizing. The work of the two city women was to put together the book that came out of their experiences. So they said to themselves, how do we frame intellectual labor and activist grassroots organizing? Why should one be on a higher plane? Who becomes the subject of knowledge and who its purveyor? Does knowledge and expertise exist only in the academy, in places of power, or does it also exist in the minds, the hearts, and the daily lives of the powerless? In this collaborative research, the women worked together over 2 years, confronting their fears and prejudices, facing their families, and working together to write the book. In the process of the sharing, they understood themselves better. One of the examples they cite is that while poverty may be an overarching phenomenon that united them because they were all poor, the ways in which it played out in the life of the Dalit women among them was very different from the ways in which it played out in other lives. The knowledge that they created together was radically different, hugely subversive. It was based not on an extensive reading of multiple sources, nor on a gathering and analyzing of data, but on the lived experiences of women. For them, writing the diaries on which the book was eventually based led them to compare each other's experiences, and that led to a nuanced understanding of caste and how it works on the ground. A question that was asked and discussed was, even if Brahmin women are deeply sensitive to the question of caste difference, can they ever feel the pain and humiliation of untouchability in the same way as the daughter of a Passi or a Raidas person can? What does it mean to feel for a group facing violence and to experience that violence yourself? A third of Sitapur's population is Dalit. Caste was present in every interaction between the writers, just as it was in every interaction between the women of the larger group to whom this smaller cohort belonged. They belonged to a larger organized group of activists who worked on labor issues. The women saw this. They talked about it. By all accounts, the conversations are not easy. But the important thing, I think, is that the conversations took place at all. At the heart of these interactions lay an important question, and one that we need to grapple with, and it is this: can collaborative research and knowledge production be imagined across borders of caste, class, region, and geography? This is a quote from the women. They describe how they wanted to question the assumption that knowledge is only that which is created by those in the academy or by outsiders. Why, they ask, can we not tell our own stories? And there is a lovely moment that describes how, in wanting to intervene in the politics of knowledge production, the women wanted to understand what counted as documentation and research. Having seen researchers bring, at that time, the tape recorder, they thought this is the instrument of power, and they taught themselves to use it and interviewed each other using that technology and thereby creating all their own knowledge. And they asked a question, which is a lovely question, which says, what would happen if our stories could replace the stories of Rani ki Jhansi in our school textbooks? What indeed? I'm going to leave you with this question, and I'm going to try now to bring together the threads of what I've been saying and ask ourselves some questions. The questions are as follows. What is the transformative potential of these new methods of research? The academy in which we work is changing. No longer is objectivity the holy grail. No longer is the questionnaire adequate. No longer are the subjects of our research passive. But it's not only research and its scope that are changing, but also the empirical base on which research is based. Given this, how must we think of research differently? What are our responsibilities as researchers, not only to ourselves, but to the subject, the territory, the people that we are talking about? These are questions that we ask ourselves constantly as feminist publishers. We see ourselves as engaged in the business of knowledge production and sharing. How can we bring greater accountability to our work? The writers who call themselves the Sangtin writers, Sangtin means friends, and they define themselves as 9 friends, tell us that, in quotes, such a notion of accountability is based on the idea that knowledge must emerge out of sustained critical dialogues with those who are the subjects of this knowledge. In this way, they say, the subjects of that knowledge become its primary evaluators, its critics, but also intellectual partners of those who are seen as experts, and even something as rarefied as theory becomes collectively produced. Before I let this go, I wanted to touch briefly on the question of ethics by taking you back to a question that I struggled to deal with when I was doing my work on partition, and I don't even know today, nearly like 25 years after that work was published, whether I took the right decision. So in the course of seeking out materials for the work, I came across purely by accident a large book, which is a government publication, so it wasn't for public consumption. I think there were only maybe a few copies produced of it, of which I have perhaps the only existing copy. And this book listed 22,000 names of women, district by district, who had been abducted and were presumed raped in Pakistan. And it gave every woman's name, her last location, her age, which kind of family she belonged to, who she was last seen in the company of, etc., which kind of gave the lie to the assumption that we often make that violence comes from the outside. This book was a researcher's goldmine, really. But to this day, I have not been able to make that document public because my lessons in the feminist movement trump my work as a researcher, and I cannot bring myself to make public, even though most of these women are probably dead, a document that might make them vulnerable. How then does research deal with this kind of ethical dilemma? Long ago, a lady called Gayatri Spivak asked the question I'm sure all of you will have in your heads, and many have often quoted, can the subaltern speak? I think the real issue was not that the subaltern wasn't speaking or that she could not. I think it was that her speech was not comprehensible to the researcher, and the researcher was unwilling and unable to listen. I don't think speech happens in itself. It becomes meaningful only if there is someone to listen. And these new research methodologies are challenging the ways in which we look at data and the larger picture, the workable sample, and so much more, as if they were the be-all and end-all of research, and as if only the truths they generate are legitimate. Today, instead, the subjects of their research are saying, no, we will not play the role you expect us to and legitimize your career. We'll speak for ourselves. That is what is so exciting. So I'm not here offering you any answers to the questions I've raised, but I am asking that all of us, researchers, writers, start to think of research differently, not as something we do to others, but as something we do with others, and without those others, our research would be meaningless. I want to end my talk on a lighter note, with 2 jokes. I actually initially thought that I would start with one joke and then end with the other. Then I thought that I can't do this in a serious Golden Jubilee talk, start with jokes. So I thought I will quietly insert the jokes at the end. You may not laugh at the first one, but the second one is a bit laughable. They are in the nature of, those before and after advertisements for losing weight or gaining hair, where you see a before picture, then you see an after picture. So here is my before joke, and the second one is the after joke. The before joke is as follows. A researcher goes into a village. Notice my feminism, because I am making this researcher a woman. Even though there's a bad light shining on her, I could have made her a man. But, we feminists are nothing if not sort of inclusive. So a researcher goes into the village with her computer and starts talking to a man who's grazing his animals. She says to him, we have a new methodology that allows us to instantly count your goats. Would you like me to do that? And sure, he says, go ahead, and if your count is accurate, I'll even give you one. So she quickly opens her laptop, gets in the Excel sheet, enters the formulas, and voila, she gives him a figure. He gives a shout of joy and says, hey, you're right. Here's an award, and he hands over an animal. And she's delighted and thanks him. A few minutes later, he says, can I say something to you? And she says, yes, of course. So he says, you researchers are very strange. You come to us with all these newfangled machines and tell us what we already know. He says, I know how many animals I have. I don't need your machine. But then he says to her, but you're the ignorant one. These animals are not all goats, and the one I've given you is not even a goat, but a sheep. And you don't even know that. You don't even know the difference. So that's the before joke. Now the after one, I haven't written it down, but it's because I remember it. It comes from the women whose book I've been talking about, the Sangtin women. It is a joke that they have heard and they often repeat in their Sangathan. And it goes like this. Mr. Researcher, man, comes from the West and he comes to do his research in a village. In order to get to the village, he has to actually cross a water body. And in order to cross that water body, he needs the help of a boatman. So there is a boat there, there's the boatman sitting in the boat. So this man asks him, can you take me across? And the boatman says, yes, of course. And so they start going across. And then the researcher thinks, well, here's an opportunity, I may as well start my research here. So he says to the boatman, hey, what do you think of globalization? And the boatman says, what is that? I've not heard of it. So this researcher says, my God, you haven't heard of globalization? That means a quarter of your life is destroyed. And poor boatman keeps quiet, thinking, I don't know what the hell this guy is talking about. Then he says to him after a while, hey, what do you think of Marxism? And the boatman says, but what's that? And he says, oh my God, you don't know Marxism? Then half your life is destroyed. So the boatman is resigned and he keeps on doing his job. A little while later, the researcher says, what do you think of feminism? And the boatman is completely foxed and says, I don't know what you're talking about. So he says, oh no, now 3/4 of your life is gone. So then they proceed, and then comes a wave and another wave, and the boat is overturned, and both of them fall into the water. And the boatman turns to him and says, hey, do you know swimming? And he says, no. And then, of course, he says, all your life is gone. Well, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Urvashi, for taking us into that contested world of feminist research, epistemology, writing, and publishing, and finally concluding it on a note of smiles and laughter. This is also self-laughter, laughing at the self as researchers, like what we are doing. Throughout, I was, when you were talking about truth and writing, so I was thinking, is writing a life, is it only about truth? Isn't truth also is in transition or constantly changing? What came to my mind was Kamala Das's My Story. She is writing her story, but the agencies and influences are constantly making her change her own story. So where is the truth then in all this maze of self-writing, life writing, recollection, introspection? Similarly, how much like is like the other and how much unlike is the unlike? So I was reminded of one thing, just please bear with me 1 minute, I'll conclude before I open for the house for questions. I was very, very inspired by the stories of the women who went underground during Maoist movement, who have written their stories. And recently the anthologies have been published by Revolutionary Writers Association. I admire the stories, but somewhere there is a connect. But whenever I try to translate them, I break down. I don't know what that experience is at all, but there is some connect, there is some disconnect. Like you said, careful listening, participatory listening, it just I break down. I'm sure most researchers, it happens to most researchers where pain or shame holds them back as well. Just a few thoughts. Thank you, Urvashi, once again. And now the house is open for questions, comments, and observations, please. No, you can sit here. I can sit here.
Okay. So in my class, when people are silent and don't ask questions, I tell them I'll count to 10. So I'm counting to 10.
Thank you, ma'am, for the insightful lecture. My question is regarding the relationship of a researcher and a researched. So when a researcher goes to the field and tries to interview women, for example, and listens to their experiences, there's often a tendency to get agitated at the oppression that one is facing on the field and the urge to suggest some solutions or try to influence their life. So how much ethical is it to give solutions? Because you also talked about the quality of listening. So can the researcher go ahead and suggest something to the researched? So.
You want to take a few questions? You can take a few more questions.
I have very little experience with fieldwork, but from the little I've seen, especially girls who come from middle class urban backgrounds, just to not know how to, not be the proper middle class girl. And I see that sometimes it's like jarring to see them trying to talk to farmers. And how would you say you conducted yourself as a woman in a field talking to people who are completely unlike you?
One more. Could you please pass the mic there? There.
Okay. Hi, ma'am. I want to ask that how a female autobiography should be researched, because in that case we barely don't have any field work, and all of them, like most of them, are dead. So, and that's also a literature that includes their experiences, that the life they lived. So how that should be researched. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for your lecture. I am asking a question as a literature student who reads narratives which are already published as secondary data. Say a book which is like an oral history has been published to me, and it is written by using feminist methodologies, and I am trying to read them as a researcher. And doesn't that risk turning those very women whose narratives are there into data again? Like a researcher and then another researcher. Under that circumstances, is there any way in which the primary researcher in the field can navigate the ways in which these women can be read?
You want me to go ahead?
You want to take these questions and then repeat the questions?
Yeah, I think so. I think I could do that.
I have 2 more questions.
Okay.
Urvashi, please go ahead. Then you can take the next set of questions.
Okay, I'll try to, let's do this first, and then we can take the next set, because otherwise I'll forget what you have been asking. So your question, I'm sorry now, I didn't write it down, so I forgot. Can you just remind me a little bit? Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I think the questions are all connected in some ways because a lot of the time when you're going into the field, you are talking to people you don't know at all, right? So how do you actually start talking to them? I don't have a solution for that. I think there are many things that raise problems for us. One of them is the timetables on which we work. You know, you have a limited amount of time to do your research, to go into what you call the field, to talk to people. And if you don't get what you want during that time, or the research gets deflected by them asking you a question like, can you help us with X or Y or Z? You don't quite know what to do. And I think that we really need to rethink this whole business of asking people to work to our timing, which is a bigger question in academia, not just something that you yourself as a researcher can tackle. The second thing is that I think in research, it is very important to be quite honest about your motivation and why you're doing it. I'll tell you, when I was researching my work on partition, in the early days, I was quite dishonest with people. I lied when they asked me what was my interest, what I was doing, because I didn't know how to be truthful. And I thought, just to avoid this, I thought, you know, if they think that, because I was going to see them immediately after the 1984 violence in Delhi. And it was a realistic expectation to think if somebody is coming to talk to you, they are going to maybe help you to deal with the impact of that violence. So I tried to hedge around that. And it was not a good thing to do. I felt terrible about it. But sometimes you need someone to point that out to you, because you're so taken up with the stories you want to get that you don't actually do that. So I had a friend who joined me halfway through my work. And she's the one who told me, why are you being dishonest? Tell the truth. Say why you're doing this. And then I started to do that, and things changed. And this kind of question did not come up that much. Yeah. So I think one thing is just to be truthful about what is possible for you, what you can do, what you can't do. That actually makes it much easier to talk to people. I don't know if that helps. And your question about talking to people you don't know, I think that, again, I have no answer to it. I think if we have time to talk to people, okay, let me try to say this with an illustration. Think about yourself as a young woman who goes in to do some research. The first people you'll meet if you're talking to people, probably men, at the tea shop, in the house, wherever, and most likely men much older than you. So one of the dangers, of course, is that they will not take you seriously, but there are also other dangers which attach to this. And I use the word advisedly, it's dangers. And you have to be extra sensitive to suss them out and see. I think establishing an equation with people you don't know, sometimes it helps to have others with you. It just helps to go in a group or go in 2 or 3 people, just makes the conversation a little bit easier to start. And once they start to trust you, it becomes easier to talk. But the other danger is an antenna that women have to develop. And it's difficult. Sometimes you don't know. Twice in my work in partition, I have been in situations like this, both times in England. I was talking to some people. One time I was talking to a man whose grandson had given me his address. And what I did not know was that he had actually killed his wife, who was the grandson's grandmother. And I learned that only later, and he thought I was coming to open up that story. And I was in his house alone with him. And it was, I could feel the fear. I could smell the fear on myself. And I just got out of that as quickly as I could. And to get away quickly, I had no money at that time, but I just decided that I would get into a taxi and take a taxi and run off, which is what I did. The second time round, I was much more careful. And I was talking to a man in Leeds, whose family had gone through partition, and I wanted to go and talk to the family, and he ran a grocery store. And he was very open and everything, and he said, yes, you come, and he said, you come in the evening, and then he started to say to me, come at this time, the store will be closed, I will be alone there, and it was like, he was making suggestions to me without making suggestions. And very soon I realized that what is going on, and I decided that I wasn't going to push myself into that. So I never went to see him. He kept calling, but I never went to see him. But I think you have to somehow develop a simultaneous thing of being able to trust, because trust is at the heart of that kind of research, and suspicion. I hate to say it, but just... So it's not easy. I mean, what I'm talking about is not easy. It's just that it is changing, and we have to think, how can we do the best with this change? Because it's a very exciting change. It offers a lot of interesting things that we can see. So I don't know if that really helps. And this question of researching, how do you research a female autobiography? That's... Who was asking that? Oh, you asked that question, yeah. And meaning, how do you look at it as a researcher might, and look into it, and how do you understand what the woman was actually thinking? You barely have any
field work, yeah, because it's actually my research topic. It's based on my research topic, and most of the autobiographies that I have selected, that the writers are there, and it's basically pre-independence and post-independence. So there are many angles, but what is the core of my question is that, as a feminist, should I be very sympathized with the life they lived, or how to be, not neutral, but how to deal it with like a researcher? Because every time I read that, I become emotional, I sympathize myself with that, and then I feel it a bit problematic to deal it with like a researcher. So that's a thing.
So, okay, now I understand your question. I think the short answer to your question is absolutely yes. I think you have to approach that material with empathy, with an understanding, and with respect for where that woman is coming from, the time to which she belonged, how difficult it was for her to write that piece of work, what could she say in it and what she couldn't say in it, in whose presence did she write it, for whom did she write it. Many women wrote for themselves privately, never put it out. I don't think that you can judge a work written, say, sometime back, or even written in our moment, from the perspective of today, from the criticism of today, and you may not like what she's saying. But I think you have to respect it for where it's coming from and try and understand why she's saying what she's saying, so that you try to enter that woman's mind, that woman's time, that woman's location, that woman's context. And I don't think that you need to worry about feeling emotional. Why wouldn't you? I mean, any of us reading a piece of work in which a woman is talking only about her husband can get angry and irritated and think, why the hell is she doing this? But at the same time, we understand why she's doing it. And we don't exercise our thing saying, okay, she's wrong to do this, but we understand what are the circumstances pushing her to do this. So I think that's how I would say that you can approach that. Yeah? Yes, I haven't written it down, so I haven't fully understood. Can you just do me the data question again? Just briefly. And next time round, I'll write them down properly so that I don't forget.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. The question was, as a reader of secondary data, if I am reading, say, an oral history narrative, and it has been written with certain feminist methodologies in mind, but as a researcher, again, if they get turned into data, then isn't it reinforcing the same problem?
Yeah, I understand that. Sorry, and I did understand it then. See, I'm not saying we don't look at data. In the same way as even though I am an oral historian, or I work with oral history, I would not knock, within quotes, traditional history as being useless. I think had it not been for, and forgive me for using traditional history, I can't do quotation marks with the mic in my hand, but I would not knock it, because had it not been for that, we would not have been where we are today and looking at other methods, other methodologies, which help us to stretch, expand the boundaries of that discipline and turn it into something different, turn it into something more nuanced, more thoughtful, more full of voice, and so on. So I'm not knocking data, and when as a reader who's reading a book, you're approaching it as a second, or reading an oral history, of course that is data, of course, but that is also somebody's voice. So I would just say, let's not forget the human being who lies at the other end of that data. Is there a way that we can take that, we can take the human voices, and we can create for ourselves a richer understanding? That's really what, so, I mean, I myself don't use data, it drives me around the bend, but I can't really knock it. That would not be fair.
Okay, my question is that you talked about Mona, and you also talk about Sappho for equality. And then you mentioned that Sappho for equality could contest the researcher because they have the intellectual capital, cultural capital, and linguistic capital to do that and push it into public domain. But when you're researching on Mona, when you're writing about Mona, not on, in collaboration, then Mona may not have, I am not underestimating her her criticality or critical faculty, but at the same time, she doesn't have that kind of capitals, those kind of capitals. So in that sense, how do you address these two questions, and how do you address your own collaboration and collaborative narratives and intersubjective experiences with Mona vis-a-vis this Sappho for equality thing? Yeah.
Suneetha, if I, yeah. Urvashi, it's always a pleasure to listen to you, and you have been an inspiration to many theses, even in this university. And I wanted to share with you something that a student of mine would say, how can I write like her? I have heard a lot of stories as well, but it doesn't come out right. And I wanted to say that I'm taking it away from today's lecture, probably back to other side of silences, but I think it's some of the ways in which you do those narratives, I think are very, very important, whoever the audience is. And now the way that methodologies have progressed in feminist studies, I think one tends to want to leave behind everything that we have done before. But somewhere I feel the answers to the many, many, many questions that you have raised are actually in the other side of silence. I was going back to what you actually read, and I think the circumstances are different, and probably the vignettes, the stories, the, everything may be very, very different, but actually the process is very much the same. And the rigor, I think it's the rigor that probably needs to be communicated in to an audience like this. So if you can talk a little bit about that process and the pain of actually listening and writing, it would help us.
Thank you, Aparna, for raising that question. It gives me a very good segue to what I was planning to ask. This has to do with the question of rigor. And I wanted to ask you, as a publisher, I'm sure one of the things that you have to regularly do is to reject proposals. I was curious to know that even when we, and here I assume a we, an insider position of being feminists, who share certain ideas of things which may not be hitherto considered to be part of knowledge, we think that we have an ethical responsibility and a commitment to include them and give them the status of knowledge. Yet, I'm sure you are forced to reject. So would you tell us more about the considerations that go into it? And this is informed particularly by my personal discomfort. I still, though I'm dangerously close to an expiry date, but I'm still an early career academic, and I'm still uncomfortable with having to act as a gatekeeper. I regularly find myself having to tell students that though I understand your passion, I recognize your involvement in this, and I want to be a party to this, but this is not research. And it is somewhat like beauty. You know beauty when you see it, but you can't really tell someone what makes it beautiful in that sense. So if you could please share some things from your own journey of rejection, of having to reject, sorry, not rejection.
Can I actually take those 3 questions, or should I wait for... Oh, there is one here, there's one there. Okay.
Hello, ma'am. Okay. It was a pleasure listening to you. You mentioned the subject being incomprehensible, so I've written my question. I don't want to be incomprehensible. And also because I'm very nervous public speaker. So you mentioned subaltern speech being incomprehensible. That reminded me of your translation of Baby Halder's book. I read that book, and then I was reading some reviews of the book wherein wherein people pointed out how there were too many characters and narrative did not flow. I personally felt that it was an extraordinary story, and while the first part did feel a bit too much in terms of too many characters, I didn't have some problems following the story, and the second part did flow. It was emotional, exciting, extraordinary, and extremely fun and satisfying to read. My question to you is, how do you as a researcher, writer, translator, and publisher deal with such objections, such reviews? Do you even find that something worthy of an answer? How do you decide which stories need to be told to a larger audience?
Okay. Are we taking one more, or?
I think quick question. Very quick questions, please.
Hi, good evening, ma'am. So a quick question for you is, I believe research today, and since ages, yes, it's being made by intellectuals and the wise, for the intellectuals and the wise, but about the marginalized. And I believe it's an echo chamber that has been made where research is being read by people who can read about it and not do much about it, you know. So my question is, at the base of it, who is research for? Who should be the target audience of research, and what truly is the purpose of research?
Good question, yeah.
I don't.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the research, talk. Sorry. My question is about epistemology. So the primary mode of research that we conduct now in academia is the Foucauldian mode, which calls for the object to be distanced from the researcher. To quote Foucault, in his lecture on juridical system, it is about the distance that you create from the object, and you need to actively distance yourself, and you need to actively destroy the object. You need to laugh at it, you need to lament it, and you need to be disgusted at it for the production of knowledge, is what Foucault says. My question as an academic researcher is, how do we academic researchers approach human subjects and transcend this mode of knowledge production? And to hitchhike on this question, I have another question about texts. I am very curious to understand what your criteria of a text is. Of course, if you apply the Foucauldian mode, you can, of course, laugh at a book, lament a book, be disgusted at a book. But you cannot do that at a person, of course. So, and then again, what do you designate as a text? What is the credibility of the text, is my question.
Hello. Hi. Hi, ma'am. Sorry. Yeah. I think I'm just thankful to all these people. I got the mic finally. Yeah. So, ma'am, I'm actually not a feminist studies scholar, but I'm a disability studies scholar. And I'm also not from this university. I come from BITS Pilani. But yeah, this was very accessible to us. So thank you, everyone, for that. So, ma'am, actually, I am co-ideating or co-designing, you can say, with children with intellectual impairments and also with visual impairments. So, as someone, as a very, very early academic myself, I explored a plethora of ethical standards and templates. And the max that I could found while working with people with disabilities are the list of ethical forms that have come out from the medical departments or the health governments, but not really something very specific to educational research or working with children with impairments. So while I understand the organic flow of non-verbal communication and things like that, are there certain ethical way of communicating with people who might not even understand the depth of your research? How do we communicate that? And I know that things go beyond ethics when we develop certain relationships because of the constant prolonged communication, but how mindful I should be when I'm working with them, and I don't try to be the voice of those people, but actually bringing those people's voices into a platform which is accessible to everyone. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the lecture. I have one question. So basically, I'm working on a subject that is heavily censored and regulated. The question comes purely from my own field of research. I'm working with army wives or wives of army personnel, and I come from literature background, researching in cultural studies. So we are not trained. Our professors say you're not trained to do interviews. So limit yourselves to representations, or like textual representation, filmic representation, or biographies, short stories. So most of my texts come from things that they have written about themselves, army wives writing about themselves, or people writing about army wives, or films, war films, where army wives are shown just crying there. Even when they're writing about themselves, they're writing it from a point of view where I feel it's very regulated, where you can only say a few things that fits into the regime or the politics of the regime. You can't say, you can't critique the army, you can't critique the military. You have to, even when you're suffering, there are resentments, you can't voice it. But I want them to voice it because it makes my work easier as a researcher. So how do I do justice to this without, I don't want to see them as victims. I don't want to victimize them as well. Where if I say something, I say this thing comes out of this short story, they are under the they may be under the radar. So how do we work this out? Is my question.
Okay. You see this mic wire is protesting because it gets stuck. He's protesting too many questions. No, it's okay. I think. Okay. This better? Okay, there's lots of questions. I don't know if I can actually answer them all because then that means another hour's lecture and you'll all be dead by then. So I'm going to try and combine some of the questions you've been asking. And not in any particular order. And if I leave something out, please give me a shout and I will try to respond to it. But I will go to the first question. Machar is here. First question that was asked, first of all. You know, you are absolutely right about saying that Sappho was able to speak because of their location, where they come from, the access they have and everything. And how would that play out in the life of somebody like Mona? So, Mona, one of the reasons, I mean, Mona was a perfectly powerful, strong voice. So she could tell me off quite easily all the time. And she knew when I was dissembling, which I was doing a lot of the time because I was struggling with myself because I didn't want to write a book that projected her as a victim. But because she had asked me to write the book, she wanted it to be her narrative. She wanted to be the victim. She wanted me to talk about how badly her family and the Hijras had treated her, etc. My book was much more focused on something else. So I didn't write it in her lifetime. I just decided, I deferred it. And I knew somewhere I was being dishonest with myself. And she knew. And she said to me, you know, you're waiting for me to die. And then you will think of writing this book. Now, of course, that wasn't true, but she died. And then I thought, what should I do? Should I write this book or should I not write this book? And I felt I owed it to her. So I thought I would write it. And I have written it, but I haven't had the guts to put it out into the market still. I read it every now and again and I think, no, this is not right. But it's a struggle, and I don't think that I will easily be able to answer that question. But what I will try to do is as honestly as possible, represent her voice and problematize the issue. And that is what brings me to the question that was just asked about the army wives, and it also goes back to something that was raised earlier, which is that, you know, when we talk to people, the subjects of our research, especially women, okay, let's talk about women. When you talk to women, and I found this when I was doing my research on partition, that the first people you come across are men. They will tell you the story. The story they will tell you is the story of the world they know, the public world, the outside world, etc. Then if you've built up trust, you will be allowed inside to talk to the women. When you start talking to the women, there will never be a moment when you will be able to talk to the woman alone. They will generally be in a group. The man will be sitting there. They will say to you what they think the man wants them to say. Or if they start talking to you about something they want to say, there is never a clear moment of leisure, time, spare time in which they can even articulate that, because somebody will come in who wants tea, food, etc., etc. Even if they had that time and that inclination and that desire to speak to you frankly, and they trusted you and they wanted to talk to you, where is the vocabulary? You know, if you're talking to a woman who's lived through sexual violence in a country that we can't even speak about sex, how do we talk about sexual violence? So when I was doing my work, this question troubled me so much because I wanted to talk to the women. I wanted to listen to them. And they were not speaking. Then I read an essay which I would recommend to everybody. It's by two women called Sherna Gluck and Daphne Patai. And it's in a book called Women's Words. I don't remember the exact name of the essay, but the book is edited by these two writers. And basically what they say is when you listen to women, you have to learn to listen in stereo. Now, this is from the time when stereo was the ultimate experience in music listening. Now, of course, we have much more nuanced ways of listening to music, so it seems a bit inadequate. But what they say is you have to listen to the speech and the silence. You have to listen to what they can say, what they can't say, what they will not say, what is unspeakable. You have to look at the body language. That is the only way you'll understand. And if your army wives are not saying anything and if their writings are inadequate to you, then as researcher, what is open to you is to problematize that. Not to try to push them into speaking, but to try to problematize the question of women's speech, how limited it is, why is it so rare, what are their silences, like that. So I think that way we can at least get something that helps us to understand what is going on. And to the question that Aparna raised and the question of writing, and then you raised at the back of selection and choice and all of that. I'll tell you, when I started to write the book on partition, I wanted to be like everybody else. I was completely enamored of the sexiness of academia. I wanted to be out there. So I was writing an academic book. It drove me mad. After about several months of trying to fit this into, those disciplinary boundaries, I just tore up everything and threw it away. Then I read this book. This is all in the life of readers and writers. There's always books and articles. I read this book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. I don't know if any of you knows it. And it's about a history of Cyprus. This man is writing history of Cyprus. And he's writing, and he's throwing everything away. And then he takes what he's written and he edits it. So it says a history of Cyprus and he puts a personal history. And suddenly the problem is solved. And I thought, Butalia, this is your answer. So that was what made me abandon the academic writing. How did I learn to write? Again, all of us start out with thinking certain kinds of writing are desirable. And this goes back to when I was in my MA. We had to write these term papers. And my first term paper was on Troilus and Cressida because I was a student of literature. And I had this tutor who was a legendary tutor in Delhi University called Mrs. Krishna, who was also known as Mrs. Isaulov because she married a Russian, and all of us were in love with her son, whose picture we saw on her wall. That was all. We never saw the man. His name was Vladimir. His picture was on the wall, and we all wanted to marry Vladimir. And so Mrs. Krishna was my tutor. And when I gave her my paper, she threw it back at me. She said, "This is rubbish. Go and rewrite it." She made me rewrite it, I kid you not, 9 or 10 times. The final time when I wrote it, I was sitting with tears flowing down my eyes. I thought, I've got to write this. And I wrote it exactly as I felt it. And then she said to me, "This is a gem, never forget, write from your heart." And I have never forgotten that lesson. So I think that's what finally led me to write The Other Side of Silence the way I did, except I didn't know then that that's what I was doing. And it was only much later that the response to the book, which still amazes me because it's 25 years old or 24 years old, but it just surprises me because I think it's somehow I found a language that speaks to people. And I'm really telling you, it's not some great feat. It was just accident that it happened, but I learned a lot from it. I learned that that's how you do it. And that somehow connects to the question of choice and publishing and the difficulty of people entering the opaque world of the publisher, because the publisher has the power to decide what should get out into the world. And it isn't easy. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. In some ways, we don't do it well. We don't do it well because it breaks my heart to read when people are trying so hard to say something and I have to reject them. So I think we must be among the few publishers who don't have an automated rejection letter that goes out. We try to read everything a little bit and write a nice letter saying, please think about this, please think about this. This is not our kind of book. But what that means is that sometimes you are months behind schedule because you can't read everything. and you want to write that personal letter and you want to be kind and people are waiting. Suneetha just told me she sent me a manuscript in February that I haven't yet looked at, you know. So it's a difficult choice. I don't know how to deal with it and what happens there. But I do know that you have to be kind because everybody's writing, everybody wants to write, they want to be published, they want their voice to be out there. And theoretically, every voice has a right to be out there. So, in a sense, how you work with people who don't fit the paradigm is either you change the paradigm, you try to change it, or you try and be kind in your responses, and we try to do a bit of both. You know, it also means, because you're dealing not only with the author, you're also dealing with the readers. You need to educate audiences and readers that getting out of your comfort zone and reading things which are breaking new ground is an important thing to do, is a necessary thing to do. So in a sense, you have to also work with readers on that. And it makes publishing much more interesting, but it makes it much harder really to do. And then to the question of how do you deal with criticism, bad reviews, etc. I think, you know, mostly I don't see them because I'm not on any social media, so I don't see them. But I think bad reviews can be hurtful. They can be hurtful. All of us are human. We feel hurt by them and we feel upset by them. But in some ways, you know, when you take the decision to write and put your writing out there, you make yourself vulnerable. It's a choice, and there will be flack, and you will have to deal with it. I still remember this time that in 2000, when The Other Side of Silence was published in the United States, it got a 1,500-word review in the New York Times. I was so excited. I thought, wow, my book is getting into the New York Times. That review was complete crap. It was done by some young man who knew nothing about partition, some young man who was studying in America. And of course, they thought, you know, the American reviews editor thought, Indian book, get an Indian to review it. So they got this Indian to review it. And he just trashed the whole book. And he said one thing that really amused me. He said, what does she think she knows about partition? You know, it's all been said by Khushwant Singh, said. So that's what made me think, okay, I know what the level is here, but never mind. But he said one little paragraph where he said, but she has collected some fascinating material. So I immediately wrote to my editor, my American editor, and said, listen, just take this out and put it on the back of the book. And he did. So it's called hoisting somebody with their own petard, but I really thoroughly enjoyed that. It was quite fun to do. I think we have to really live with it, deal with it. Your question, your epistemological question about texts and how do we understand texts, and, you know, I don't know if I can answer that, because when you're looking at those questions within the theoretical frame, just as you're looking at questions of who is the author, what is authorship, is it individual, is it collective, what is all of those things, I think that you are just, it's not my scene, actually. I actually don't know what to do with it. I look at it and I think, forget it, you know, it's something that I don't necessarily need to concern myself with. I think, yeah, a text is what you write, a text is what you express, a text is what you put out there in the world as a way of communicating, as a way of expressing. And it can take different forms. And I think that we need to look at these questions also in the context of the advancement of technologies. Because we could have argued when paper was the only thing that we were using in the world, which doesn't happen until as recently as the 18th century, because before that we are using all kinds of other materials. And when paper comes to the world of book publishing is very suspicious of this ephemeral material, which later becomes something that is seen as a sign of permanence. But previous to this, it's vellum, it's animal skins, it's cloth, it's palm leaf, etc., etc. So now with the advancements in technology, the whole question of what is the text and what is its permanence and what is its ephemerality is changed. So we have to also look at it in the context of changes in technology. I don't think that answers your question, but it's what I think I can say about it from what I know. I don't know if I've answered all the questions. Let me see. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Who is research for? Okay, again, I think research now is so much more than academic research. If you look at the world of publishing, there are so many books now which are out there in what is called the trade market, which is the general market for general readers, where you see deeply researched, really solid, really interestingly written books, right? They're not books that enter the, I mean, look at Jyotirmay's books like that, which are there for general readers. So I don't think that we can say who is research for. I think research is obviously for the writer themselves and what interests them and what they want to do. What you do with the research, where do you want it to reach, that depends on how you write. You might choose to write in an academic way and therefore limit its circulation to those who are knowledgeable about the subject. You might choose to write in a more accessible way and put it out there, or you might choose to do both. And I think both things are happening. So that's why when I was talking, I was saying I locate myself firmly within that middle space, which is some distance away from academia, firmly located in activism. I will never write in an academic way because that's not what interests me. But somebody else might choose to do that, and they know who they're reaching out to. But theoretically, research is for everybody. It should be for everybody. And everyone should have access to it. So we have to find ways of making it much more accessible. And that means going beyond the form of the book, going beyond the form of the text, and actually creating other forms. Like now you get so much interesting stuff coming out in graphic stories. So much interesting stuff in audios and podcasts and all of that. So new ways of putting out research also. Have I left out anybody? I have left out your question. The disability question that you were asking. Yeah. So I think, I don't know. I think this is new terrain. I don't know. We haven't done enough work on what are ethical ways of communicating. But I do think that as researchers, as writers, as publishers, we carry a responsibility to think beyond just those who are able to read, able to access, and to see how the materials we create can actually go out much further, which means thinking of the products. I'm speaking now as a publisher, because it's much easier as a publisher for us to think of that. So I think, which means thinking of, within quotes, the products in forms that are accessible. And we are trying very hard to think of this in Zubaan. So we are looking at, for example, how can even navigating our website be made easier for those who cannot read, who are not sighted? How can we make all the material that we create accessible as audio files, but not priced, so that it can actually reach out much further? And we don't know, but we are trying to do that. And in the thinking of that, I think the one way that we learn a lot is to talk to people who are located inside the disability spectrum, whether it is physical or it is different, and to learn from them, because it's something that those of us who have not had to face this don't actually know. I don't know if you've heard of this organization called Rising Flame. It's a Bombay-based organization, and the woman who heads it, her name is Nidhi Goyal. Nidhi is not sighted. And every time Nidhi comes on a Zoom call, she will not turn her video on, because she can't see, and therefore she feels that you must see the darkness that she lives in, and therefore you can't expect her to turn her video on. And the first time I was on a Zoom call with Nidhi, I was a bit foxed. I didn't quite know what was going on. Then I had to think about it, and I talked to her about it, and that's when I understood. I think we have to make that effort. Okay, I hope I've answered all the questions. If I haven't, please shout outside, and over tea maybe we can do that.
Thank you, Urvashi. Thank you, colleagues from University of Hyderabad and from other universities and student friends. I think the auditorium came alive with questions, responses, and your talk. Thank you so much. I request Debomita from Center for Women's Studies to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. As part of the formal vote of thanks, I would like to begin by extending my sincere gratitude to our distinguished speaker, Urvashi Butalia. Thank you, ma'am, for being present here as a part of the Golden Jubilee Lecture Series 2. I think your lecture brought out some very critical feminist dilemmas that we face in the field. The question of who can write about whom, what is the truth in the field, and how do we write about lives that constantly negotiate marginality. Also, personally, I felt that the need and the compulsion for the single coherent narrative of marginality that researchers are constantly looking for, you at levels challenge that with your own stories. Thank you, ma'am. I also thank our head at CWS, Professor Suneetha Rani, for chairing this session and always bringing such critical feminist lectures to us. The Golden Jubilee Lecture Series 2 has been possible because of course, the ideation and the execution of our Dean, School of Social Sciences, Professor Jyotirmay Sharma. Thank you, sir. And the organizing team, some of whom are here with us and some are working at the background. Thank you so much, all of you. The Office of the Dean, School of Social Sciences, CWS and CV Raman have been a constant support for this lecture series. So I extend my sincere gratitude and appreciation to all of you. Also, thank you to this fantastic audience here for all your engagement and questions. I think all of us had a lot of good time hearing these questions and the responses to it. It was a very thought-provoking evening, thanks to all of you. Finally, this lecture series has been supported by the Institute of Eminence, and I take this opportunity to acknowledge the IOE's encouragement in bringing engaging academic discourses to the university. Thank you. Have a great evening.